This is the story of Harry Truman. It's the story of Harry S. Truman and the 3 Mac attack. The 3 Macs being McCarthy, McCarren, and MacArthur. It's a story on the soft-on-communism Republican offensive of the late 40s and early 50s and its profound effect on the Truman administration. Now, let me start out by saying that Harry S. Truman was a boyhood hero of mine. I vividly recall a picture of Truman with that broad Missouri smile on his bespectacled face, waving a copy of the Chicago Daily Tribune with the banner headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." How many remember that? You probably all do, yeah. I can still hear his twangy voice mimicking H.B. Kaltenborn early on a November morning in 1948, and I loved the fact that he simply went to sleep on the night of the election. They had to wake him up, tell him he was president. And historians have, by and large, been good to Harry Truman. He was a farm boy from the Midwest who made good, a man of the people, a man who could give them hell and didn't give a damn about rank or social standing, or even about generals of the Army, even 5-star generals. Why, he even fired one and lived to tell about it. All these things I loved about Truman. The fact is that upon close examination during his 2 terms in office, and with just a couple of notable exceptions, he was unpopular. Now, those notable exceptions came during the months immediately following Roosevelt's death in 1945. In November 1948, when upon his election he barely polled a plurality of the votes in a hotly contested election, poorly attended. And for a brief period in 1950 and 1951, as MacArthur drove past the 38th parallel to the Yalu, and just before the Chinese communists came down in force and drove us nearly out of Korea. Unfortunately, during the rest of his administration's terms of office, Truman's poll ratings were abysmally low, falling at one point in 1951 and 1952 below even those of Richard Nixon during Watergate. Truman had the misfortune of following in office perhaps the most charismatic American leader of the 20th century. The tale is no doubt more apocryphal than true, but when Truman reportedly paid a condolence call on Mrs. Roosevelt immediately following his taking oath as president, he said to her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything we can do for you?" And she said, "No, Mr. President, the real question is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now." Truman was reportedly numb. Life had been going along just swimmingly for Harry Truman. He had enjoyed a very successful term in the Senate as chairman of a committee to investigate and report on governmental excess and corruption in the production of war material. The Truman Committee, which he generated, by the way, was his own creation. It was a great contributor to the war effort. He was widely hailed as a straight shooter, a man who would abide no phonyism, no cronyism in that capacity. It was widely understood, notwithstanding the fact that Truman was admittedly the protege of the infamous Pendergast machine in Kansas City, in Missouri, and his political mentor, Tom Pendergast, at the time, was in jail. Truman, when he originally came to the Senate, was called not the senator from Missouri, but senator from Pendergast. Although Truman had been a surprising choice as Roosevelt's vice president to replace Henry Wallace on the ticket, Truman was doing just fine in the office. He was a good reader. He was enjoying all the trappings of the office, including presiding over the Senate, which he loved. Truman, in fact, may have been the only major Democratic politician who had never really given much thought to the possibility of Roosevelt's death. In fact, the imminent probability of Roosevelt's death. It came as a bombshell to Truman, and he frankly admitted he was scared to death. While he was in office, Bess Truman said it was like watching her husband driving a supercharged car at suicidal speed around the Indianapolis Speedway for 18 hours a day. Now, before Truman, the Republicans had had little to take issue with. We'd been in a war, and Roosevelt was a great wartime leader, had been nothing short of a god. Truman was not. So in 1945 and 1946, when our story begins, we find the Republicans, who had been unable to influence U.S. policy for over 2 decades, searching desperately for issues which had brought them success in the past. After a number of false starts, they finally began to zero in on the activities of the former Dies Committee in the late 30s and the soft on communism issue. The issue, which had flourished before the war, had been quiescent after we entered the war on the side of the Soviet Union, and here the Republicans hit a soft spot. They began to reconstruct the rumblings of that notorious Dies Committee, urging that the New Deal was not only a leftist movement, which was soft on communism, but harbored treasonous fellow travelers as well. The Republicans formulated an anti-democratic version of the war years. Now they began to allege that to promote a third term for himself and to avoid democratic defeat, FDR had taken the nation into World War II, echoing many of the old isolationist war chants of the 30s and early 40s. After Truman took office, the Republican attacks intensified and now included allegations that FDR had sold out to Stalin in 1945 at the Yalta Conference, in agreements abandoning Eastern Europe to the Russians. Some New Dealers reacted by going on the defensive. Not Truman. Truman was a fighter. He had proven himself a courageous leader of troops and a very successful gunnery officer in the First World War. And his knee-jerk reaction to the Republican attack was essentially the best defense is offense. Truman determined to preempt the issue by becoming the staunchest anti-communist of all. But in so doing, he may have unwittingly abetted a significant attack on our freedoms in the late 40s, in the early 50s. That's the issue. Professor Bruce Kuklick, in his book, The Good Ruler, makes this astute observation. Quote, Truman believed that the precept and example of his anti-communism was good policy and good politics. He needed Republicans in order to implement democratic foreign policy, and he also felt a duty to keep the issue of communism in responsible democratic hands, and out of those of partisan extremist Republicans. In using the issue, however, Truman aided its legitimization and helped to make it the measure of international policy. Well, let's examine this thesis. Last week, we touched on the activities of the Dies Committee. Although Martin Dies mercifully had retired from public life in 1944, fearing defeat at the polls, we saw last week how that committee was revived in the 40s by the likes of J. Parnell Thomas, John Rankin, and eventually Richard Nixon. Following in the footsteps of Martin Dies, who had drawn wide support from the extreme right in the late 30s and early 40s and had sown terror among the liberals, a coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats ironically fulfilled the dream of Samuel Dickstein and established the House Committee on Un-American Activities as a standing committee of the 79th Congress as it opened in 1945. Truman, the successful gunnery officer, determined to steal their thunder. A case arose in January 1945 involving the alleged turnover of classified OSS documents to a liberal bi-monthly publication named Amerasia, which specialized in Far Eastern political and economic affairs. This was compounded by a report in the summer of 1946 by the Canadian Royal Commission of widespread Soviet espionage in Canada. Truman, in attempting to preempt a HUAC investigation of the breach of this security, first named a study commission, and then in 1947, following the recommendations of that commission, established a federal loyalty program. Now, this program required loyalty oaths of all federal employees, whether they were involved in security matters or not. More ominously, he created security files on all federal employees. The administration pledged that these would remain confidential, but the list was made available by the State Department to congressional investigators headed by one Representative Robert E. Lee. Unfortunately, the files tended to reflect the biases and prejudices of the security investigators who prepared them. It certainly did not catch any spies. There were ultimately only 57 names on that list of persons still employed by the government, and there was literally no information in there of an espionage character whatsoever. But this list that became known as the Lee List literally died. Nothing much came of it. But the list ultimately found its way into the hands of Joe McCarthy, who brandished it in the air when he had nothing but bluster to back up his charges. Truman came to regret opening these files to congressional investigators and later denied them access. David McCullough, in his superb biography of Truman, which I commend to all of you who haven't read it yet, relates that as his life neared its end, Truman admitted that in hindsight, his loyalty program had been a tragic mistake. Now, Robert Griffith is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In his work, The Politics of Fear, Griffith describes a theory of Athan Theoharis in his book called Seeds of Repression, Harry Truman and the Origin of Mccarthyism, concerning this aspect of Truman's policy in the late 40s. McCarthyism, he says, was not only a logical extension of traditional politics, but was also a function of the Cold War and of the rhetoric used to sustain it. The success of conservatives, and in particular the Republican right, was made possible, says Theoharis, by the dramatic changes that took place in the climate of American politics between 1945 and 1950, changes that Theoharis argued were in large measure the product of the Truman administration. Truman's militantly anti-communist rhetoric, Theoharis insisted, contributed to a new political environment that narrowed the arena of legitimate political debate and sharply reduced the flexibility of American foreign policy. The administration's conservative critics, he concluded, were faithful to Truman's own assumptions when they denounced the Alda Conference, blamed the administration for losing China, and demanded total victory in Korea. Now, Kuklik points out that historians have debated whether this anti-communism was good or bad for the country, and the extent to which Truman bears responsibility for creating the issue. His critics argue that he became an accomplice, even if unwitting, of McCarthy. Truman, they say, made matters worse than they otherwise would have been. The president's defenders, on the other hand, claim that he did what he did, and he did what he could to cap an irrational movement, and things would have been worse without his comparative restraint. Kuklik goes on with this perspective. A significant factual matter is usually overlooked in this inconclusive politicized argument. Truman could not control anti-communism. His enemies used it to destroy his authority with the electorate and to drive the Democrats from the White House. Well, that's Kuklik's theory. Did Truman really lose control of the anti-communism issue? Did it become like that out-of-control race car that Bess Truman described? Was it like the horns of a bull that Harry had grabbed onto, couldn't let go? Let's see if this is so, and if so, then to what extent and to what effect. On the foreign policy front at this time, the Truman administration was concerned that massive economic reconstruction was required among our natural trading partners in Greece, Turkey, and Western Europe. Truman knew that the recovery of these former allies was necessary quite apart from the issue of communist military takeover. In point of fact, the administration did not believe at this time that the Soviet Union was much of a military threat. When they later realized that it was, of course, they hastily formed the NATO alliance, but that was not until 1949-1950. But in 1945 and 1946, the administration did believe that the financial reconstruction of American allies and trading partners in Western Europe was a necessity. Kuklik points out that impulses to social revolution in Europe would be nurtured by economic instability, and so financial reconstruction was the priority. Well, Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State, fashioned a policy of support first in the form of aid to Greece and Turkey, which became known as the Truman Doctrine, and then, of course, the rest of Western Europe through the doctrine that became known as the Marshall Plan. But the Truman administration had to work with a Congress which was dominated by budget-conscious members of the GOP. This was a Congress that could not be easily persuaded to support giveaway programs to Europe. They were not exactly charitable types. This led the administration to present an intentionally altered rationale for its own programs. It focused almost entirely on the communist menace in Western Europe, rather than on the economic justification for its programs in Europe, which would have been compelling in and of themselves. After all, Europe was on the brink of economic collapse. Our natural trading partners, and with them our foreign markets, were in danger of disappearing. But Truman and Acheson downplayed the economic rationale of the programs, which might have been condemned as charity by the Republicans in Congress, and elevated the communist menace to the forefront as the rationale not only for domestic policy, but for foreign policy as well. Truman just could not resist using this prod. Did he have to do this? Well, we have a debate. One side said yes, the other side said no, he didn't have to do this. What's clear, however, is that in doing so, he won the support of such isolationist stalwarts as Arthur Vandenberg and other theretofore obstreperous isolationists, lawmakers in the Senate, and many necessary programs like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, passed. But in so doing goes the reverse argument. Instead of refuting the GOP story of a sellout to communism, the Democrats indirectly confirmed and emboldened the Republican sellout rhetoric. That's a debate. It's a difficult debate. Did he have to do it? Did he not have to do it? However, Kuklik points out that in the election of 1948, this is interesting, Truman offered an alternative to what he portrayed as the extremism of the Republican reaction on the right and the extreme radical positions of third-party candidate Henry Wallace on the left. The president contributed to making the progressivism of Wallace as important a campaign issue as the right-wing extremism of the GOP. It worked. He won, albeit by a thread. He was ahead of the GOP in what became a barrage of accusation and counter-accusation. But then, the president began to lose his edge. For on Truman's watch, two events occurred, which significantly affected his ability to control the Republican sellout rhetoric. One was the Alger Hiss affair, and the other was the fall of China to the communists in 1949. Now, last week, we saw how HUAC had developed out of the reaction on the right to the intellectual thunder on the left in the 30s. And we considered how that intellectual phenomenon in the 30s created cannon fodder for the HUAC crusades. In the late 40s, HUAC was investigating alleged communism in Hollywood and in the labor unions. Sooner or later, it was inevitable that it would turn to communism in government. Now, Alger Hiss was a graduate of Johns Hopkins and Harvard Law School with high honors, and he'd served as a clerk to the great Oliver Wendell Holmes. It was an Eastern Establishment Ivy League symbol for all that Richard Nixon, Carl Mundt, J. Parnell Thomas in the House, and tail gunner Joe McCarthy in the Senate abhorred. He had served as a counsel to the Senate committee, in the Solicitor General's office, and then as an advisor to Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. He was secretary of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which first drafted the Charter of the United Nations. And he was serving as head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace when Whittaker Chambers, a self-confessed former Communist Party member and a senior editor of Time magazine, testified before HUAC that Hiss was a Communist Party member. Hiss, outraged, appeared before the committee to rebut the charges and testified that he'd never met Chambers in his life and had never been affiliated with any communist organization. Hiss dared Chambers to repeat his story outside the privileged chambers of the committee room. Chambers promptly obliged, repeated his charges on Meet the Press. Hiss sued for libel. When in pretrial, Chambers produced 60 State Department documents which he claimed Hiss had given him in the 30s. The public took some notice. But when Chambers led investigators to a pumpkin on his farm where he had allegedly hidden microfilms, which he claimed he'd received from Hiss late in the 30s, the case took on all the intrigue of a John le Carré spy novel and leaped onto the front pages. On December 15, 1948, Hiss was indicted for perjury. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second resulted in Hiss's conviction. It was, of course, HUAC's shining hour and became the springboard for the meteoric rise of Richard Milhous Nixon, whose dark side we'll explore in more depth next week. The conviction of Hiss on January 21, 1950, wreaked a thunderstorm of abuse on the Truman administration. Nixon and Mundt now demanded that Truman ferret out those government employees whose Soviet leanings have contributed so greatly to the deplorable mess of our foreign policy. Wild accusations abounded that Dean Acheson was working for Stalin and Russian agents were running loose throughout the country. The Hiss case declared Richard Nixon was only a small part of the whole shocking story of communist espionage in the United States. Next week, incidentally, we'll see how Richard Nixon claimed he won the Hiss case in the press. Up to this point, the career of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had not been one of a meteoric rise to fame and glory. He was, to say the least, undistinguished. Through his defeat of Senator Robert M. La Follette in Wisconsin, However, he had learned the technique of the big lie. He campaigned as Tail Gunner Joe, a wounded veteran flyer, taking full advantage of the public's enchantment with returning combat veterans, in particular with wounded ones. In so doing, McCarthy contrasted himself to La Follette, who had not served at all. McCarthy charged that La Follette was guilty of war profiteering. He had not one shred of evidence of this. Not only was this a big lie, but McCarthy's military persona was a gross exaggeration as well. Although McCarthy had flown on a few missions as a guest, actually as an observer, he was not a tail gunner. He had earned the nickname Tail Gunner Joe simply as a joke, when one day he mounted the tail gun of an aircraft, a grounded aircraft, sitting on a runway, and as a lark, fired off its tail gun into the woods for target practice. So that's Tail Gunner Joe. McCarthy had been wounded during the war, all right, but his wounds, minor as they were, didn't come from combat. They came from a routine Neptune initiation ceremony performed as a prank by sailors as they crossed the equator. The junior senator from Wisconsin had been totally unnoticed in the Senate. Up to 1949, his only significant appointment had been to serve on a committee to investigate alleged unfairness to German officers who participated, admittedly, in the Malmedy massacre. Well, the German officers were not exonerated. The investigation went nowhere, accomplished nothing, and McCarthy was stalemated. At a now infamous dinner in Washington's Colony restaurant arranged by McCarthy to find an issue on which he could distinguish himself, one of McCarthy's invitees, Father Edmund Walsh, who was dean of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, asked, "How about communism and government as an issue?" McCarthy pounced on the suggestion. He immediately sensed that he could ride the communist and government issue to fame and glory. "The government's full of communists," he declared, now suddenly the champion of the cause. "The thing to do is to hammer them." Up to that point in his career, McCarthy had had no role whatsoever in the anti-communist movement. A month later, however, he was on a plane to Wheeling, West Virginia, to appear before the Women's Republican Club of Wheeling on the occasion of Lincoln's birthday. It was not a particularly high-profile audience, but given his stature at the time, limited stature, it was the best his handlers could find. But the group in the speech would soon become front-page headlines. Tucked away in the briefcase McCarthy carried with him were notes for a hastily assembled speech, which McCarthy alleged contained a list of 201 communists in government. The speech was so hastily and so shoddily prepared, in fact, that his speechwriters, who had originally thought there were a list of 201 communists, had later narrowed that list down to 57. They had simply failed to alert old Tail Gunner Joe. Undaunted by this change, and after his Wheeling accusations of 201 had made headlines, McCarthy contended that he had only mentioned a list of 57 employees of the State Department in his Wheeling address. McCarthy knew that there was no tape of the talk. The radio operator of station WWRA in Wheeling had reversed the tape and erased the entire speech. McCarthy knew that. Shades of Watergate. Challenged by the press when he reached Reno the next day to name even the 57 names, McCarthy steadfastly maintained that he had such a list, but he was not at liberty to reveal it. Now, in so doing, McCarthy took a page from the Dies Committee book, which continually did this. He also took the opportunity to demand that Truman revoke the directive closing the loyalty files to Congress, and charged that Truman's failure to do so was simply labeling him and the Democratic Party as the bedfellow of international communism. Now, what did McCarthy have in his hand? He had the Lee list of 57. It had nothing on it whatsoever. He had zero, nada, zip. Now McCarthy, who had been searching for an issue in which to build a record, found one. What became known as McCarthyism did not spring from a vacuum. It was grounded in a set of attitudes, assumptions, and judgments with deep roots in American history. The fear of radicalism, from the Alien and Sedition Acts to populism. The Alien Acts following World War I, the Espionage Act, 1917, Sedition Act of 1918. The Palmer raids, Coughlin, Long, the Dies Committee, the first reaction of the right to the intellectual thunder in the left in the 30s, and the sedition mindset it bred, all there as precedents for McCarthy to draw upon. Truman, in attempting to interdict the Republican attack, may have unwittingly abetted the attack by establishing the confidential loyalty files of the government employees. Remember, he had in fact allowed congressional investigations under Representative Lee to use these files in 1948. And although he subsequently denied HUAC the use of these files on the grounds of executive prerogative, it was too late. Cat was out of the bag. McCarthy had an issue. Although we now know that McCarthy had no evidence whatsoever of communists in the government when he delivered that infamous speech in Wheeling, none whatsoever, immediately following the speech, McCarthy quickly recognized the insatiable hunger of the press for sensationalism and drama. Now he realized how electrifying an issue this could become, whether or not he had any factual basis for his charges. McCarthy's speeches were sheer fantasies, but the political fallout from them was very, very real. Some congressional leaders began to fear McCarthy. They mounted a counteroffensive. The Senate established a committee under Senator Millard Tydings of Delaware, a very respected congressional Democrat, to investigate McCarthy's charges. Remember, Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to discipline its own. Now the battle lines were being drawn. Influential columnist Westbrook Pegler, Fulton Lewis Jr., George Sokolsky lined up behind McCarthy. So did the powerful Hearst organization. Hearst, in fact, furnished McCarthy with researcher J.B. Matthews of their organization, who had been a staff member and staff director of the Dies Committee. McCarthy was also joined and financed by a wealthy industrialist named Alfred Kohlberg, a mysterious character who for 30 years had been an importer of Chinese textiles and reportedly headed up the China lobby in the United States. Kohlberg was a persistent exponent of the thesis that the State Department had betrayed China to the communists, a theme readily espoused by McCarthy. This cabal of publishers and Kohlberg fed McCarthy with information and staff assistance that he could never have otherwise afforded. Tail Gunner Joe's career had now emerged from the shadows. His star was now in the ascendancy. McCarthy, thus empowered and also encouraged by Kohlberg in this respect, now accused Owen Lattimore of being a communist. But who was Owen Lattimore? Lattimore was a Far Eastern scholar who was director of the School of International Relations at Johns Hopkins, and he had served briefly in the State Department as an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. Lattimore had also accompanied Henry Wallace on a trip to China in 1944, which McCarthy now implied was a sinister event. Louis Boudin's, former head of the Communist Party in the United States, had appeared before McCarthy's Senate subcommittee and declared that Lattimore had been a member of the communist cell, actually, within the Institute of Pacific Relations. The Lattimore case looked like another Hiss case in the making, this time in the Senate. Boudin's was discredited by many witnesses brought to the committee by counsel Abe Fortas, such as Bella Dodd. Bella Dodd was a member of the Politburo of the American Communist Party, and she described Boudin's testimony as laughable. The report of the Tydings Committee concluded that nothing in the McCarthy files showed that Lattimore had ever been a communist. Adopted on a straight party line vote, however, the committee report denounced McCarthy in harsh terms rarely used by fellow senators. It accused him of having perpetrated a fraud and a hoax upon the Senate and upon the American people. Well, you'd think that would be the end of McCarthy? Not at all. The result of the investigation would actually aid the rise of Joe McCarthy by elevating him to the role of the embattled defender and symbol of the communism in government issue. In the aftermath of the Hiss case and the fall of China to the communists in 1949, the Truman administration was highly vulnerable. Its popularity, which had never been very high, was now at a very low ebb. McCarthy had struck at a sensitive nerve, and communism in government became the major Republican campaign issue in 1950 elections. Although McCarthy's constituency was Wisconsin, in the midterm election, McCarthy concentrated his efforts on defeating his Senate nemesis, Millard Tydings of Delaware. Among other nasty tricks, McCarthy distributed a fake photograph depicting Tydings in a friendly conversation with communist leader Earl Browder. Millard Tydings, long a major political power in Delaware, went down to defeat along with many other prominent Democrats against whom McCarthy campaigned, such as Scott Lucas in Illinois, who was defeated by Everett Dirksen. The overall results of the election of 1950 were devastating to the Democrats. The Republicans picked up 5 seats in the Senate and 28 in the House. And McCarthy was a major factor in that election. Tail Gunner Joe is now emerging as a force to be feared and reckoned with. It was in this atmosphere that Senator Pat McCarren, who controlled the Senate Judiciary Committee, used an investigation of communism among aliens and nationality groups as part of a xenophobic campaign for more restrictive immigration controls. McCarren now introduced a new sedition law. What had started out as the Munt-Nixon bill in the House of Representatives was now renamed after McCarren. It was formerly called Subversive Activities Control Act of 1950. The bill covers 26 pages of the United States Code annotated, sets up an elaborate registration system for public disclosure for groups and individuals whenever these are Communist Party members or are ruled to be closely or remotely linked with the World Communist Movement, so-called Communist Front organizations, which we discussed last week. A Subversive Activities Control Board was established and empowered to determine whether an organization was operated to advance the objectives of World Communist Movement, or could be qualified as a second type, a Communist Front organization. Any organization so determined by the board was required to register with the Department of Justice, and failure to do so could cause drastic penalties. For example, a $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison for the officer of any organization which failed to register, each day being a separate offense. These were provisions prohibiting any of these persons from using the mails from employment in government defense facilities, which were broadly defined to include factories, harbors, laboratories, just about every other place of work imaginable. They were also forbidden to belong to labor unions and were denied passports. Well, what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that in the political climate, fostered in large part by the growing strength of McCarthyism, Senator Pat McCarren was actually able not only to introduce, but to pass through both houses of Congress an act which energetically discouraged in countless ways the expression of ideas, which were not criminal, but simply happened to incur the displeasure of a government-appointed thought control board. Such provisions were essentially the severest form of sedition law. Again, they vested in an agency, an arm of the federal government, of the executive, the right to judge and to interpret a rather vaguely worded statute as to what these organizations were, what constitutes such an organization, without any immediate check by another branch. Now then, the separation of powers there really died. Such provisions cast a heavy burden on those who wanted to keep them on the statute books in light of the First Amendment. Truman vetoed the McCarren legislation in 1950, calling it just that, a sedition law, and comparing himself to Jefferson in 1798. Remember, Jefferson left Philadelphia in 1798. He was so disgusted with the passage of the Alien Sedition Acts, he just left. In so doing, Truman stated, "In a free country, we punish men for the crimes they commit, but never for the opinions they have." But the atmosphere of fear and mistrust in this country and the sedition mindset that had been generated was such that the act nonetheless was passed overwhelmingly over Truman's veto. We were close to an election. Democratic representatives and senators were afraid to vote against it. As it turned out, the McCarren Act never amounted to much in actual practice. Portions of it were ruled unconstitutional. Other provisions were ineffective. Fortunately, only a handful of individuals were harmed by it. Now, it was amid this atmosphere in June 1950 that Truman, while he was having dinner in Independence, received a call from Dean Acheson advising him that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea. His immediate reaction was to move quickly and drastically to intervene and hit him hard before the Republicans seized the initiative and made an issue out of it. Truman felt it especially important to demonstrate the Democrats' virility on this issue. He would move with alacrity to take the thunder away from the right on this one before further soft on communism allegations emanated from them, which could devastate the Democrats. No formal declaration of war was needed, or simply joining a United Nations police action. Now, the battlefield leader in the Pacific, as we all know, was Douglas MacArthur. Initially, the North Korean military had swept south, virtually unimpeded by a weak South Korean force. After a daring tactical gamble at Incheon, UN forces under MacArthur fought their way up the Korean peninsula. Truman and his closest advisors were elated and now felt that the crisis could be managed for domestic political gain. Truman regrettably determined to tie his political fortunes to those of MacArthur. And in this instance, things clearly did spin out of control. Buoyed by battlefield successes, the administration acceded to and even promoted MacArthur's request to take the fight into North Korea to the Yalu. This notwithstanding the fact that the original aim of the police action was simply to restore the status quo ante, the status quo before the attack, split the Koreas north and south. Unification of Korea by Western power now became beguiling to Truman and Atchison, and American audacity in the field seemed to be rewarded. The administration balked, however, at MacArthur's ill-conceived request to cross the North Korean-Chinese border at the Yalu River and to carry the war into China. This, they figured, was going too far and can very well provoke a Third World War. Well, unfortunately, they had sanctioned and, in fact, encouraged the goal of freeing all of Korea. Their sanction was given to this MacArthur escapade, despite the fact that there were repeated warnings by the Communist Chinese that they would not tolerate a hostile presence on their border. In the latter part of 1950, Truman was also fearful that the GOP would accuse him of appeasement if his position were more moderate. In point of fact, Truman's popularity for several months in 1950 was never higher. If he had chosen to join MacArthur to outflank his domestic foes, to outmaneuver the Republican right at its own game, he seemed at that point to be succeeding. But it was a tragic mistake. Truman determined to seek negotiations at this point to end the war. MacArthur, apprised of a planned presidential statement that would propose negotiations to end the war, released his own declaration. He proclaimed victory in South Korea, described Chinese military capabilities as hopelessly inferior, threatened an expansion of the war, and offered to meet the enemy commander to arrange an unconditional surrender. In so doing, of course, he showed amazing audacity for a field commander in interdicting the executive on a matter of national policy. And in so doing, he also showed a total disrespect for the administration. Then, the war changed dramatically. The Chinese came streaming over the border in numbers never even dreamed of by MacArthur. They swarmed over and collapsed the UN forces by sheer force of numbers, seemingly indifferent to casualties. It was a form of warfare MacArthur had never, ever encountered before. The UN forces suffered a series of humiliating defeats as they were again pushed back below the 38th parallel, below Seoul, almost off the peninsula entirely. By now, things had indeed spun out of control. Despite these defeats, MacArthur continued to speak publicly, evidencing again that he had no respect whatsoever for the commander-in-chief. When House Minority Leader Joe Martin read into the congressional record a letter from MacArthur calling for the establishment of a second front by the Chinese nationalists, thus attempting to influence foreign policy by appealing directly to Congress, Truman, the artillery captain, was furious with MacArthur's flagrant usurpation of executive authority. Truman finally had had enough. He made up his mind to fire MacArthur right then and there for rank insubordination. In so doing, he compared his situation to that of Lincoln in firing McClellan during the middle of the Civil War. I admire Truman's pluck in making this decision. Tragically, it came too late. Now, General Walker was in line to replace MacArthur. When General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident on December 22, 1950, Matthew Ridgway replaced him. And here, Truman finally caught a break. Ridgway proved to be a superb field commander, both a fine tactician and a leader of men. At the end of January 1951, under Ridgway, the UN forces regained the initiative and mounted a counteroffensive. By March of 1951, they had retaken Seoul, but this time they stopped at the 38th parallel. There, truce lines were eventually agreed upon after many months of negotiation in a large tent at Panmunjom. It's been estimated, however, that Truman's decision to strike onto the Yalu, despite repeated warnings by the Communist Chinese government, which may well have resulted in no small part from his fear of being outflanked by the Republicans on the soft on communism issue, had cost over 30,000 American lives. When in the spring of 1951 Truman fired MacArthur, the uproar at home testified to the fact that Truman had again fallen from grace. MacArthur returned to ticker tape parades and addressed before Congress and national acclaim. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And although true to his word, MacArthur did eventually just fade away. The tragic result of all this was that in 1951 and 1952, the Truman administration was discredited both domestically and internationally. By 1951, Truman's popularity had dropped to 23%, a record low. By spring of 1952, it was only 26%, and many Republicans were calling for his impeachment. The Truman administration was effectively powerless for the remainder of its term and accomplished virtually nothing worth mentioning from the MacArthur firing on. McCarthy perceptively sensed this weakness in the Truman administration and stepped up his attacks not only on the administration, but on others as well. The result of all this was an atmosphere of fear that we all lived through and which many of us will never forget. People were afraid to sign any petition, join any organization, speak their mind in public, lecture in colleges and universities, sermonize in churches and synagogues, produce films, write books, articles, even to be seen in company of people who dared to express opinions. I'm sure you all remember it. Many were terrified into becoming witnesses against colleagues, neighbors, relatives, friends, and teachers. Professors were not only cowed into revising their lectures and their course reading materials, but were fearful that what they said, even in private conversations, would be repeated in the wrong places. Many were dragged before the committee by subpoena to testify. A number took the Fifth Amendment and were barred from their profession when they returned. Others were blacklisted. It was a period of time not unlike that portrayed by Arthur Miller in The Crucible, when we slipped almost without realizing it down the slippery slope of 17th century Salem. Like the characters in The Crucible, one author points out, America engaged in a psychodrama of mystery and revelation, invoking imputations of guilt and protestations of innocence. Accusations without one shred of evidence were immediately assumed to be true. The guilt of the accused was simply presumed, no matter the bona fides of the accuser. A letter by a housewife, a store clerk, or whoever, whether or not it was pure fantasy, could jettison the career and reputation of a public figure. I'm sure that many of you here can elaborate on these tragic happenings from bitter personal experience or that of friends or colleagues. The witness subpoenaed before McCarthy's Senate subcommittee or before HUAC was faced with a Hobson's choice. If he refused to state whether he'd been a member of the Communist Party or so-called Communist Front organizations, he faced a contempt citation from Congress. Conviction and jail followed. Had he answered the questions negatively, and many had indeed flirted with Marxism and communism during the period of intellectual infatuation with liberal socialism during the 30s, which we explored last week, he faced certain indictments for perjury. If he admitted party affiliation, he faced the ordeal of naming names. And in the case of HUAC, attack on the film industry and other targets, he would be blacklisted. The influence of McCarren, too, is pervasive. I don't know how many of you here are lawyers, but the American Bar Association recommended at that time that all lawyers be required by the respective state bar association to sign loyalty oaths under penalty of disbarment. And further, if they'd been members of a prescribed organization, no matter how long ago, they are to be prohibited from practicing law. I'm sure that many of the lawyers here may remember that. Here was an ex post facto resolution that made it a crime to practice law if one had been a member of a vaguely defined organization. A resolution actually passed by lawyers in convention. It was fortunately never adopted by any state bar association, even by the bar of the state of Texas, which had proposed it, so that no lawyers I know of ever had to sign such oaths. Lawyers, of course, are officers of the court, sworn to uphold the Constitution, which expressly forbids ex post facto laws. Many lawyers dropped their membership in the American Bar Association immediately thereafter and have never rejoined. In the minds of many lawyers, the organization, even today, still bears the taint of that fateful resolution. We all lived, in great part, in a Gestapo-like atmosphere almost never before known in this country, and those who lived through it will never forget it. Many are still scarred by it and will never be the same. Well, such are the factors that brought freedom to the edge during the Truman administration, and for a short while thereafter, until McCarthy was eventually denounced by the Senate following his disastrous performance during the Army hearings and a magnificent piece of lawyering by Joseph Welch of Massachusetts. The bulk of the Republicans in the Senate finally abandoned McCarthy after the Army hearings debacle, and after he accused even President Eisenhower of a shrinking show of weakness toward Red China. Eventually, when McCarthy apologized to the American people for having urged General Eisenhower's election in 1952, even his most stalwart supporters left the fold. Finally and fittingly, when our balance of powers was most seriously threatened, this time by an emboldened legislative branch, and when xenophobia and national crisis, remember our themes, had allowed the legislative branch to become all-powerful during the height of McCarthy's career, it was McCarthy's unrelenting malevolence that brought him down. It was in the end his cynical image of man and of mankind that prompted these now famous lines from Joseph Welch on live television to a vast national audience, following an attack by McCarthy on a neophyte member of Welch's staff. Senator, until this moment, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Little did I dream that you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do injury to that lad. Your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. Have you left no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency? And with that, Welch rose, walked out of the Senate hearing room to ringing applause, and thereafter McCarthy's career and soon his life were over. A Senate resolution condemning McCarthy was passed in December 1954. And with the passage of the resolution, McCarthy not only passed out of the national limelight into obscurity, but also went into severe physical decline. The alcoholism which had plagued him throughout his career finally did him in. He died less than 3 years later, in 1957, at the age of 48. There's both a conclusion and an epilogue to this story. Here's the conclusion. Historians certainly differ on whether Truman's anti-communism was on balance good or bad for the country. Perhaps he did have no alternative. Perhaps he did have to usurp the issue, both for political reasons and to prevent it from being shaped only by irrational extremists. Personally, I'm willing to give credence to that argument. What is clear, however, is that his actions did eventually serve to embolden the Republican right wing. Certainly the loyalty oath issue came back to haunt the administration in the midst of the madness known as McCarthyism. In this witch hunt atmosphere to which the Democrats may then have unwittingly contributed, the loss of China in 1949 and the Alger Hiss affair came as cruel blows. And Truman felt it increasingly important to demonstrate the Democrats' strength as opponents of the communist movement worldwide. In so doing, Truman may have aided the legitimization of this issue and helped make it the most important measure of both our foreign and domestic policy. This, then, may have energized not only McCarthy, but McCarren as well. Finally, after launching into Korea and condoning MacArthur's reckless attempts to drive to the Yalu, despite Chinese warnings, the issue did mushroom out of Truman's control, and undoubtedly not only cost countless American casualties, but may well have effectively destroyed the effectiveness of his administration from the remainder of its term. The fact remains that he was essentially powerless from that point on. So much for the conclusion. Now here's the epilogue. Another fact keeps haunting me when I study this era of our history. For sitting in the Senate, observing the onslaught of the three Macs on Truman and its consequences, was Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was then a freshman senator from Texas, had been elected by the slim margin of 87 votes. In Michael Beschloss's second book on the Johnson tapes, recently released, entitled Reaching for Glory, we see Johnson revealing on tape that he knew we could not possibly win in Vietnam virtually from the start. Virtually from the beginning of his commitment of further troops there in 1963, Johnson knew he couldn't win. You can hear those tapes, and so there's an audio of it, striking. Yet he felt an unfathomable compulsion to drive on, a compulsion which eventually drove him to a nervous breakdown, compulsion which eventually developed into a paranoia, which found Johnson actually hiding under the covers one morning while giving interviews, a compulsion that Lady Bird Johnson recites in gripping detail in her personal diaries of the period now made public by Beschloss, a compulsion which undoubtedly shortened Johnson's life. Why? Why this compulsion that cost the lives of so many Americans in Vietnam, so plagued the conscience of our nation, literally tore our country apart? At times I hauntingly wonder whether the fear of being pegged soft on communism, which so haunted Truman, and which may have propelled his preemptive actions and the resulting tragic blunder in North Korea, had perhaps subliminally become an obsession with Johnson as well. Was Johnson then not unlike Truman, I wonder, another Democrat who was impelled by this fear, this obsession, to grab hold of the anti-communism issue, only to see it spin out of control? It's a chilling thought. I mentioned at the outset that historians have in the main been kind to Harry Truman. He accomplished many great things. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, just to mention a few. He had moxie and leadership abilities, and he was a humble, God-fearing husband and father who was loved and respected by his staff and by those who worked closely with him. Personally, I admired Truman. I loved the way the little man from Missouri stood up to and sacked MacArthur, who was certainly one of the most charismatic leaders of the time, and one to whom even Franklin Roosevelt had shown great deference. But in summarizing the effect of the Truman administration on our freedoms, I can't help but reflect on how different it might have been, how many American thinkers and performing artists might not have been stifled, how many American lives might have been saved from pointless slaughter in North Korea and perhaps even in Vietnam, had Truman the gunner officer not been impelled or perhaps required to outflank the Republicans on the soft on communism issue, an issue that may just have gotten away from him. Well, in the late 40s and early 50s, we've seen how a runaway Senate subcommittee under McCarthy brought us close to the edge, and how a re-energized HUAC gave birth to the career of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Well, next week we'll examine that dark enigma, Richard Nixon, and freedom again brought to the edge during the Watergate crisis in the 1970s. Thank you.